welcome to Science Cafe Concord. My name is Dave Brooks. I write for the Concord Monitor, Granite Geek, and I have been doing Science Cafes for more than 5 years. Those of you who've shown up before will notice that Dan Marchek is missing. He is one of the founders of Science Cafe. He had one last night, actually, in Guilford, another one about heroin. So he didn't make it to this one. And I believe this is the first one that I know of that he has missed in the entire 5 years. So Dan Marchek and Sarah Eck. Dan Marchek lives in Brookline, down on the Mass border, and Sarah Eck of Hopkinton started this because I just wanted basically an excuse to go to a bar, frankly, and they retired a trivia contest. So they thought it'd be cool to start, and they sort of wrote me into it. And as I've said, I figured it was a great idea that would last 6 months and fizzle out. We started here in Concord, moved down to Nashua when I was working for the Nashua Telegraph. It grew there, and now we've expanded. It's still running in Nashua. Dan does it down there, and I do it up here. And it's been great, and the Concord reception's been terrific. So topic tonight, as you know, is the science of beer and brewing, and we have panelists sort of from the entire gamut of the field. Starting with, let's see, at this end I got Ed Ramshaw, who is the president of the Concord Area Homebrewers. How many people in here currently do or have in the past tried home brewing? Okay, all right. Yeah. And next to him is Christopher Shea, who is the head brewer at Henniker Brewing Company, an example of sort of the mic.
Sorry, dude. No applause here.
That's why you were handing out those $5 bills earlier. I wondered about that. I couldn't forget. So, an example of sort of the microbrewery revolution that New Hampshire and everybody's been going through. And finally, we have Otto Kuhn, who is the senior brewmaster, which is really, a title you'd really like on your business card is brewmaster. Senior brewmaster at Anheuser-Busch brewery in Merrimack. And that's his Clydesdale out on the street, as you might have wondered. So actually, I normally let you guys tell us who you are, but I've already done that. So let's just plunge right into it. So I'm gonna start out with you quickly, Otto, and to tell us about what is yeast, because yeast is kind of the key. So exactly what is yeast?
So the question is, what is yeast? Yeast is a microorganism, natural microorganism, lives in nature, and there is multiple types of yeast. Yeast ferments sugars and makes alcohol. That's the key of what we do here. But yeast can do many things wrong, and it can do many things right. Depending on the type of business you're in, yeast becomes the sort of the life form of the brewery. My job is to keep the yeast happy. That's what I do. When the yeast is happy, good things happen. If the yeast is not happy, I got to tell you, I got problems, okay? And so I pretty much dedicate my entire life, because the yeast never takes vacations either. It works 24/7, 365. That's weekends, holidays, Christmas, New Year's, Thanksgivings, the yeast is working, okay? And, my job is to keep it happy and to make great beer. You guys want to add a little more?
So what does it mean to say it ferments it? What exactly does it do? No, you can go ahead. No, you can go ahead.
Yeah, I can go ahead. Excuse me. When you're talking about yeast, especially with regards to commercial brewing from the smaller scale of even 5-gallon batches all the way up to the large, how big a batch size are you? 100?
630.
Batches? Barrels batch?
Barrels per batch.
630 barrels per batch, a barrel being 31 gallons of beer. It's a lot. We are a 15-barrel brewery in Henniker, New Hampshire. When you talk about fermentation and what yeast does, you should keep in mind that the modern dimensions of brewing and beer fermentation were largely redefined by the invention of the microscope and Louis Pasteur isolating yeast strains and actually being able to kind of pick apart what does what in beer. Prior to Pasteur, many scientists argued that fermentation, which is the process of breaking down and metabolizing sugars to create alcohol and CO2 was a chemical reaction, that there was some sort of catalyst within the unfermented beer that caused alcohol to be created. And prior to that, they thought ghosts did it. That's not a joke. That's why they're called spirits. They thought that like spirits, yeah, fun. That's actually my favorite noise that everybody makes when I tell that story. But prior to that, there were, in any particular beer, many, if not dozens, strains of yeast and other fermentative bacteria, some that would produce a variety of byproducts such as lactic acid, diacetyl, to the point of producing goopy, ropey, endoplasmic strains, which actually basically turn your beer into Play-Doh. And then Louis Pasteur showed up, and we slowly, after the discovery of what was called the first codified yeast strain, which is Saccharomyces clausulensis, I believe. Yeah, Carlsbergensis, excuse me. Which is the Carlsberg yeast strain, which you can buy still. Beer became much more uniform because you were able to isolate a single yeast strain. In the case of my brewery, it's an American ale strain commonly called Chico, USO5, any number of things. Anheuser-Busch has their own proprietary yeast strain, which is constantly being produced in St. Louis, where I'm from. In fact, St. Louis's Anheuser-Busch's yeast fabrication plant is the third largest brewery in the state, right after Anheuser-Busch, and I think Boulevard took you guys over on the yeast fabrication plant. But it used to be number 2, and now Boulevard, and then the yeast fabrication plant. So with these monoculture breweries being created, you had a more industrial feel to brewing and a single strain, which is much more manageable. Like Otto said, happy yeast makes happy beer, making much more reproducible, more consistent beer. But in answer to your question, what yeast does is it consumes sugar and produces alcohol and CO2. Now, when you talk about wild yeast strains, there's a billion things that they do, but that's good. Yeah.
Different strains of yeast can have different tolerance to alcohol. What is the highest percent that a yeast could go to? And the other question is, you reuse the yeast strains over and over. Is there any degradation over time, or can you just keep on doing that? Or does it start to depart from its original strain?
Let's start with the second question first, and that's, as far as generations, they call it, of yeast cycles. What is it like? I guess each brewery has their own personal thought process on how long that is, but what is some 6, 8, 10 generations?
It really depends.
On the actual yeast strain as well.
So it really depends. There's a variety of factors that go into the regularity with which you create new yeast or propagate a new strain or a new culture of the same strain of yeast. Our brewery, we bring our yeast strain up to about 11 generations, which is fine, and we do it based on cell counting and slurry density. But we also don't have a full-time lab like Otto does. I know I've worked at other breweries where they've brought them to 35 generations, and I know for a fact that Switchback Brewery is on their 1000th generation because they're just letting it fly. Personally disagree with that philosophy, but that's just what they decided to do.
The yeast at Anheuser-Busch is the same strain of yeast that Adolphus Busch brought from the Old World back in 1857. And we have been maintained in the same strain of yeast through the years. A generation of yeast is basically 1 week, at least in lager beers. In ales, since they take longer to ferment, it would be probably 10 to 14 days, 1 generation of yeast. So we keep the yeast at our brewery for 10 generations, but it's the same strain, and in St. Louis we have a team of people that constantly keep making new yeast, and we send them to all the breweries around the world that brew Budweiser. It comes in liquid form, we get about a keg of yeast every month or so, and we propagate it, and you can quickly bring it up to, my batch of beer is 630 barrels. We can bring it up to that level to ferment in about, I would say, 5-6 days. And then that would be the first culture, okay? When you get it back and you pitch it, it's the first generation, and we run it up to 10. We found out that through the years, if you keep yeast longer, some strains tend to take over. Some generations are different than others. And then they start getting bad habits, okay? And when the yeast gets bad habits, then you get problems, okay? Sometimes the habits they get is like yeast sediments too much, or it floats too much, or that kind of things, you know? So if the yeast sediments on you, and you have a long aging period like we do, then the beer doesn't ferment. It just doesn't age properly. Or if you have too much in suspension, then there's too much competition for food, and eventually the yeast will weaken, and you may get off notes on the beer from that. So we've learned through the years to keep it at 10 generation. We do it religiously throughout the system, and that kind of guarantees the quality and consistency of our beers.
When I think of yeast, and you say a specific strain, I think that they all have the same genome. They're all exactly the same. Is that correct? So you're not talking about one specific species of yeast. You have a variety of strains within that.
That is correct, yeah.
So they don't all have the same genome. Have you done the lab work to figure out how they may differ?
Well, I do not know exactly whether or not it is the same genome for each yeast. I mean, that it comes from a single family that eventually, grew into different types of yeast. But I can tell you that we have done a complete DNA analysis on our beer, on our yeast, okay? And we can actually identify whether or not the beer or the purity of the yeast that we have working in several breweries to guarantee that the strain that we're using is the Anheuser-Busch strain. And it's very particular, okay? Now, every brewery basically has a different kind of yeast, and the yeast contributes basically the bulk of the flavor in the beer. So you have malt that gives you sort of a base, you got the hops that give you the spice, and then the yeast contributes the rest of the flavor. And each brewery has a signature flavor, and it's basically from the yeast. So whether or not they are all more than likely in the same family, but they're like different races, okay, if you want to think of it that way. And but each brewery has a unique type of yeast, and there are hundreds of varieties that you can get from. You can get them commercially, but I cannot answer that question for you. I don't really know that much.
You mentioned flavor comes from hops and malt. Could you elaborate on those?
Well, we can all elaborate on this. I mean, you're making a beer. You're using the basic materials are malt. You can use rice, corn. You can use oats. You can use many types of grain. Okay, and the whole idea is that the grain contributes starches to the mash. Okay, the enzymes in the malt change the starches into sugars, and then what you're doing in the brew house is changing basically starches from cereal grains into fermentable sugars that the yeast will ferment. Now, I'm not going to get into the technical aspects of how many kinds of sugars you're going to get, but basically that's what you do, okay? And then the hops, what the hops do is that's really makes the difference in the spicing of the beer. In the old days, there were many types of spices used in beer. You go back to the Middle Ages, you go back to the time of the Egyptians before hops were really popular or maybe did not even exist, okay? But So nowadays we are beginning to use many of these spices. So you start getting like orange peel, you start getting a lot of citrusy notes in the beer, you start getting a lot of different flavors that are maybe not typical to a lager beer, but they are, sort of revolutionary.
Shandies.
Sir?
Shandies.
Shandies, yeah. But there are many ways of making beer. So you got the hops, you got the malt, and then the yeast is what really gives you the character, the higher amplitude, the flavors. For example, in Budweiser, the signature of our beers is the esters that you have in the beer. And esters are the fruit flavors that you get from it, okay? And we prefer the white fruit flavors, such as bananas, peaches, apricots, like green apples, that type of flavors. And this very unique signature to our beer. Now, we don't want any of the red fruit flavors. We don't want any prunes. We don't want any raisins or that type of, because to me, that's an oxidized note in Budweiser. But it depends on the kinds of beer you're making. If you're making a darker beer that has more flavor and character, it could be a porter, it could be a stout. Maybe you're looking for those chocolate notes. You're looking for the coffee notes. You're looking for the more burnt bitter, sometimes smoky. So it depends on the type of the beer that you're making, the flavor that you want to get from it. And some you can get from the malt. Most of it you can get from the malt, but also the yeast contributes to it. And it's very unique. Every brewery has a unique yeast. And you can change the flavor of the beer by changing the yeast.
Two questions. One is relative to tankage. You said that yeast can be problematic. It can float. It can settle. They can do different things. I imagine there are a number of variables, temperature, humidity, everything else. So I would guess, correct me if I'm wrong, but I would guess that there's the ability for consistency and homogeneity, a homogeneous solution, to have a variable speed mixer in these tanks that you could slowly, very slowly circulate, so keep everything homogeneous. That's one question. And two, I take it with the number of variables relative to yeast, I imagine that you, like Henniker Brewing, you would use a different yeast for amber versus porter versus...
Nope.
No, the same. And I was going to ask the same of Anheuser-Busch. So you use the same yeast for whatever you make in Merrimack, I'm guessing, 6 different brands. You use the same yeast?
To answer the last question, for lager beers, we use the same strain of yeast. We use Anheuser-Busch strains, okay? But if we're making a specific ale, for example, we have 3 different ale yeasts in the brewery currently, okay? So I'm making Bass Ale, for example, and that uses a specific strain of yeast. We're also making some Goose Island brands, and that requires a specific brand of yeast. But I have the ability to propagate it from, like I said, like a keg that I get from St. Louis, or from the parent brewery. They can ship it to me, and I can, propagate it very quickly, and be able to pitch to a batch. So we pride ourselves of being able to handle many different strains of yeast. And above all, the one thing that we take a lot of pride on is to make the beer true to style and true to taste. So if we say that it's an ale beer, it's made with ale yeast. And if it is a lager beer, it's made with lager yeast. But also within the different brands that we make, there is so many different styles, right? And you want to stay true to style and true to taste, and have the consistency to be able to do it day after day. And that's where the job of the brewmaster comes in. Being able to guarantee that quality, the consistency everybody says the consumer doesn't know anything about beer. And I gotta tell you, that's wrong, okay? There is more knowledge probably in this room about beer that you because anymore everybody is so into what's new, and we have an actual revolution going on in the United States right now in the brewing industry. I mean, together as a group, we collaborate with each other, and there is so many styles and so many different ways of making beer anymore that there are no boundaries, there is no limits. And the craziest thing you can think of is the one that works, okay? And sometimes the one you cannot repeat, okay? And so it's a wonderful time to be in the beer business in New Hampshire and in the Northeast, and you can see it with buses going around all over the place. We have a tour facility at the brewery in Merrimack. We've had it for 47 years, right? You should see buses coming through. But they don't just go to our brewery, they go visit all the breweries in the area. And it becomes it's a holiday thing people do. Just go for a whole weekend visiting breweries. It's amazing.
You said yeast turns sugar into CO2 and alcohol. I was wondering if it was possible to turn CO2 and alcohol into sugar by using yeast, and if so, what conditions would allow this?
No, it's not.
It would be pretty hard, okay? Trees take CO2 and make vegetable material, make fruits and things. So, trees got that mechanism to do it. But so going back to sugars is very difficult to do, at least in the brewery. But trees have the mechanism to do it. Obviously, they make fruits, right? And they make barley and they make starches and things. So the mechanism exists in nature.
That's the whole, bioethanol industry. They've been trying to do that. There was the company up at Dartmouth, Mascoma, trying to break down cellulose to do that, and it has proved elusive, at least at the commercial scale.
Hi, it's my understanding from fermentation, and maybe this is more of a problem in distillation, you get other products besides alcohol. You get volatile organic compounds. Could you talk about those a little bit?
Who wants to grab that one? Diacetyl.
Fermentation is a very complex thing, okay? You generate CO2, but you also generate a lot of flavors, organic flavors in the beer, right? And the ones that we studied the most are basically contributions from the hops that give you the aromatics in the beer, very characteristics of like IPAs, where you can get the citrusy, piney, earthy, you can get all kinds of flavors from that, right? From fermentation, though, what we get is esters in the beer. And you really don't want, you want to control your fermentation in a way that you get the positive aromas in the beer. If you ferment too hot, then you start making higher alcohols. Higher alcohols have, in very small quantities, they have a very high intensity in flavor, in aroma, okay? And we really don't want that in a lager beer, but some of the ales that ferment at room temperature, they get more of that type of note, okay? And then the type of esters, like I mentioned before, is what gives the beer the beery type flavor. Then you can start getting into the chemistry of brewing, okay? He mentioned diacetyl, for example. Diacetyl is a very flavor-active compound in beer, and it's generated by the yeast during fermentation, and then it's reduced. In light lager beers, we have the lowest levels of diacetyl that you'll see anywhere. We are in the 4 or 5 parts per billion, okay? And that's very small, because in a light lager beer, you don't want any of that. But in a sort of like a Bass Ale, for example, we have like a 30 parts per billion diacetyl. And it's all controlled. We can measure it, we can control it. And we know what it takes to, keep it, bring it down, move it up, whatever. But then in a porter or a stout, it doesn't really make any difference. You can be 50, 60 parts per billion, and what it does is it's add a mouthfeel and additional flavor to the beer. It makes it taste fuller, which is kind of detrimental in a light beer, but is positive in other types of beer. Then you get acetaldehyde. Acetaldehyde is in the process of making alcohol. The yeast makes acetaldehyde that eventually hydrolyzes into ethanol. And so it produces a certain amount and then it reduces it. That typical flavor is of a green apple flavor, but it can also get in high quantities kind of solventy and, how would you say it, almost like paint thinner, okay? And then that's in real high quantities. Or it can get very veggie-like. The way I identify it sometimes is like something I don't, it's a type of vegetable, green vegetable that I don't like, okay, in the beer. So, there are many other things that it can impart taste in the beer. So you have some negative things like mustiness, and mustiness comes from, from many things. If you have dirty equipment or you have musty malt or something like that, very small amounts impart large, is a huge impact in the beer. So in a part per trillion basis, it can ruin a whole batch of beer. And what we have learned through the years is that if you get the best quality materials, then you don't expose yourself to these kind of things. And then you have to know how to handle them. You got to keep them dry, keep them on the right conditions, and then you control your process and you have a happy outcome, okay? Did I answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Well, I have a question. Well, everybody sits in their hands about homebrewing, actually. When I was a kid or starting to drink, nobody did homebrewing except real weirdos. And it seems to have become much more prevalent. And I'm curious, is this because of the technology has changed, or the market has changed, or somebody was good at selling the idea, or what? I mean, how come it seems to have exploded in the last 15 years?
It's an interesting question. The technology, I don't think, has really changed. It's pretty much the same process that they've been doing for hundreds of years now. Laws have definitely changed. I think it's only been 4 or 5 years ago that they actually made homebrewing legal in all 50 states. I think like anything else, it was just sort of I don't even know what to say. It's time, and it had this, my personal affinity for homebrewing is the blend of art and science. You actually get to mix the technical aspect of it with the artistic aspect of creating a beer. I mean, you got to know both in order to be able to do interesting things, I guess. But yeah, I mean, it's been growing steadily since the 70s. I remember my dad brewing beers back in the early 80s was my first exposure. He didn't do such a great job, and we had, I think he was moose breath, I think he was trying to make out of Moosehead beer he was trying to reproduce, but they ended up blowing up downstairs in the basement where I was sleeping, and that was my first introduction. But I got involved in homebrewing in '94, where the culture out there was actually a little more advanced than it is. I guess not anymore. We're about the same, but back then, at that time, it was a very popular thing going on out there. So
out there
it's been in Oregon, on the West Coast, and it's been steadily growing since then to kind of where we are today, which is also, we're putting the cart before the horse. It's also kind of what drove the craft brew revolution that took place as well. More so starting on the West Coast with some of the Anchor Steam is a big one, but there's a couple other ones out there, and it's just sort of that innovation that drove. They got to work together. One drives the other.
Thank you very much for everybody showing up. Thank you to our panelists.